Good evening, and welcome to our virtual Nightnotes pre-concert conversation. A few days ago, Tim McAllister sat down with two of the composers whose music you will hear tonight, Chad Sir Wick Hughes and Karalyn Schubring. Here's an insider look at how this music came to life.
It's so great that we could connect over this. And they're like, what was your inspiration for writing this piece? I know it had origins as a violin piece.
After I wrote, so the original piece, of course, was a piece I wrote for my wife.
Okay.
And then I realized one day, I was like, this might really work for saxophone one day.
Right.
And I did some sketches, yada, yada. And on a whim, I put it together and I just sent it to Tim. I was like, hey, man, here's this piece, you know? And I looked at the register, everything, and I pulled out some other pieces, some of the classic French pieces. I really looked at the repertoire, and then I listened to some of the I looked at the finger charts and I looked at some altissimo fingerings. And I said, okay, this could probably work here,
So what does this piece mean to you in terms of
that's a great question. And there's another confession of sin. Professor James Aikman, Dr. James Aikman is my biggest inspiration.
He's the man. He's the man.
Yeah, I love that man. He really got me thinking about how to compose. He is the source for me. And he always wanted me to write more chamber music.
Okay.
And I, for 15 years, just would not write chamber music. It just didn't really speak to me. But coincidentally, there are two pieces that I wrote. My cello suites for Ethne Elliott and this piece for my wife. So these are the only two chamber pieces really over the past 20 years that I've written, basically.
Okay.
And so this was my first piece that I really wrote kind of for the violin. And so what happened was I started tweaking some things, and I remastered one of the recordings, and I realized the power of chamber music, because it's hard to write chamber music. It's hard to write a piece for a solo instrument and piano and keep everyone's attention. So it was really a start for me to really revamp myself as a composer, to really appreciate the discipline of writing good chamber music, because it's hard. It's one, if I got an orchestra, I got 40 colors sitting right there.
Right.
But if you're writing for a solo instrument and a piano, if it's a weak piece, it'll be noticed very, 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 very quickly. So it's definitely been a challenge.
I think it came off really great, especially because each section of this piece, as the audience will hear, it's kind of it's its own character. You have that figure that keeps coming back, boo dot dot boo dot dot d dot. You have that, but I think I described in my sort of off the cuff description at the beginning of the concert, I think I described there's so much I hear in this that just, I don't know, I'm just kind of reaching a little bit, but if we're talking about, the roots of a composer, I think about growing up in Detroit, just the unbelievable mashup of music that you're exposed to growing up in Detroit.
Exactly.
It's unbelievable. And you can just go down what's the international market? What's it called? Downtown.
Oh, Eastern Market.
Yeah. You go downtown, you walk one block and you're going to hear three kinds of music playing in the outdoor restaurants, the bars that are right there, and then you go through and it's literally just this, tapestry of everything, so I remember mentioning something like that. And then, it's just like, you can't escape the culture of Motown and all of that. So I just kind of hear almost like panels in this piece. Like what should the audience listen for?
So structurally, and this was funny because I didn't necessarily plan this way. So structurally, this piece is really a rondo.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I wrote it and didn't even realize it was a rondo. I was like, oh, this is a rondo. And basically the origins of this piece, there's actually another origin. It was actually like a hip hop beat at first. And then I just had this motif and I just really couldn't work it. And then one day, Tammy had asked me for a piece, and I had 8 days to write it, basically.
Okay. Okay.
And I was like, oh, okay. And so once again, you can't really do much with a tritone. I mean, you can't really do anything with that. Like, what can you do with that? You can't really develop it because it's a tritone. It's relative within itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what I was able to develop was the end of it. And I was like, oh, I can develop that. That could be my syntax for everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So and that's what I used as that. So I took the tail end of that phrase and used it as my development structure. Because it's only, like I say, there's only so much you can do with a tritone.
I felt like there's like a whole, to me, there's like an entire you know, there's almost like calypso party music.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's
Exactly.
amazing. You know, like it's just there's like a whole like even. Anyway,
you're right, because I don't know if Ms. Cooner doesn't know this. So S.L.I.C.E stands for soulful Latin and classical environment. So so that's why it was like, okay, how can I take something like what I hear from Motown and hear, you know, from Mexican Town in Detroit, and how can I place this in, you know, into classical music? And that was kind of, like I said, the inspiration from that.
And I think it's just a piece that's emblematic of Detroit and your upbringing and our relationship. And I just think this came together so well, and we're really happy that you could be with us for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about Rise, and of course, apart from our collaboration and the fact that it was a commission for a specific occasion, like what was your inspiration for writing the piece beyond, like, you know, our prodding and begging? No.
Well, yeah, I hadn't written a piece for alto saxophone yet. At that point, I had 2 soprano saxophone pieces, and so it's been really fun to have reasons to add to the repertoire I've been working on for saxophone, because I just think it's an awesome instrument. I took lessons for like a year when I was growing up just to get a sense more of like how woodwind instruments work and what it means to be an instrumentalist who breathes. So ever since then, I've just really had an awesome appreciation for the instrument. And going to the University of Michigan and hearing about your studio and seeing all the amazing things that your students can do, having you ask me to write you a piece, I just really felt like the sky was the limit in terms of what I could write for. So felt like a main impetus entering the piece was it's going to be virtuosic and fun, and just make them do a bunch of hard things. And it was really fun to write.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it fit perfectly to our project goal, and maybe our viewers, for them to have a little insight on that. Your piece was part of an entire set of commissions that are meant to either serve as like a concert opener or a concert closer. And I find your piece fits either one of those models. You know, it has sort of the same characteristics I would want to find in either an ending encore or kind of a real just splashy opening. And we haven't, I'd have to say, we don't have a lot of those pieces that fit that bill exactly. And I think your piece does it like remarkably, and it sits right at that kind of 5-minute window. And maybe we're at a point in time where that kind of a piece has maybe increased relevance because of the attention span of frankly our society. What was the process like writing the piece, maybe for our viewers?
I do a lot of my composing at the piano because I am a pianist myself. And so I always feel really at home when I get to write anything that includes piano. The piano writing in this piece, a lot of it, you'll notice Dr. Ames doing a lot of these sorts of things with her hands. They're right on top of each other. So they're doing these hocketing patterns of interweaving with each other. So I remember it just being a lot of fun to write that kind of style of piano writing, just because it's just fun to see what melodies got to pop out and interact with the saxophone line. and layering all the different textures. Even though there's just two instruments, there's a lot you can do with both of them.
In your case, and with this piece, this was our first performance back after a year off together, essentially.
Wow.
And so it's really meaningful to kind of pull this piece out, which was the sort of the last piece we got before everything shut down. So, you know, I felt like the title of the piece being Rise is quite apropos, you know, and whether or not that was, I mean, certainly that wasn't in your thinking, but for me, it literally emerged and as a galvanizing point to return to some form of live performance. Yeah. So maybe what should the audience listen for in this piece? What would be some earmarks for them as listeners?
I would say right at the beginning, there's to me the opening theme it reminds me a lot of like a French old movie or like the
very much
or like the score for Catch Me If You Can, which is like one of my favorite film scores. It's very like it kind of frames that like kind of dark place of starting out, of like the mournfulness, and it's very short-lived, but it's still framing everything else that comes beyond it. It's not just we're immediately launching into very virtuosic music. It's framed from this place of, you know, we're coming from a place of sadness, of looking inward, and there are a couple moments where things switch back. There's sudden character shifts where it gets fun and playful, and there's, you know, bursting onto the scene at the end, and so yeah, I would also encourage the audience to listen for those sudden shifts, and how even in once we feel like, okay, I think things are starting to clear up now, there's still all kinds of twists and turns. Like no progress is totally linear. There's still things that come in and out from out of nowhere, and I think this piece kind of captures a little bit of all of those things.
Yeah, I would completely concur. I felt like the piece opens almost in kind of a 20s cinematic you know, classic sound, you know, and where it's hard to really identify whether, you know, the sound is sits in a jazz world or a classical world. It's kind of mostly just literally atmospheric, you know, noir film music or something, you know, something about it, you know, that melancholy. But you're right, and then it just bursts forth, and so I just think it has a little bit of everything for everyone in a short little piece.
Piece, yeah.
So, maybe another kind of you know, direction for our viewers here, like, you know, why does contemporary music matter right now? Like, or just in general? I mean, with the state of contemporary music and contemporary art, what's the case that we need to make for it now at this point in our history?
Yeah, that's a hugely important question, especially as everyone's wondering, like, what's going to happen to arts venues? What's going to happen to, you know, these things that we're used to doing that have been institutions in our culture, and they just haven't been around for a year. So what's the point of going back, or what will it look like to go back to it? And I mean, when we think about our history as humans, so much of it is marked by what was being made at that time. Like we look back on World War II, or like, you know, huge cultural moments, and one way that we're able to frame and process those things as human beings is what was being made. Like, how are people creating? Where was their mind at? And so it can be really cathartic right now in the moment of what is really happening. Like, how are people processing this? How can I look ahead? How can I look inward? Art makes you stop and think. And so much of our culture is telling us to keep going and push things aside. And so, especially music, as a composer, I have the power to make you sit in a seat for as long as I want you to. It's not a painting that you can just walk right by. And so I take that very seriously, as like, I value your time as a listener, and I hope that the experiences that I create through sound are ones that take you on an imaginative journey or contemplative one, just as a moment to mark the moment that we're in.
Absolutely. I feel like every major artistic movement in civilization has been a reactionary movement to either some kind of world event or some kind of traumatic event. I mean, look at the Renaissance after the Middle Ages, and like the rebirth of society after these plagues and all. So here we are in a very similar state, and I just think there's evidence that the arts could rebound in a very dramatic way. Thank you so much for being a part of this again, and I look forward to discussing all this with our patrons after the concert.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for Virtual Night Notes. I'm Beth Ann Cooner, and I'm the Development Officer for Detroit Chamber Winds and Strings. I have the pleasure of hosting tonight's concert because the performers are my former teachers. We are in for a treat with world-renowned saxophonist Timothy McAllister and pianist Liz Ames. Some of you joined us for our pre-concert conversation with two of the composers of tonight's music, Chad, Sir Wick, Hughes, and Karalyn Schubring. Those full-length interviews will be posted on our YouTube channel. Now, a moment to thank our generous sponsors. The Virtual Night Notes series is co-sponsored by Mary Brevard, Jane Conway, and Lynn Myers. Tonight's performance is sponsored by Marilyn Hay Webster, and Tim McAllister is sponsored by Gail and James Straith. Thank you so much to those individuals for their support. Stay with us after the performance for a live Q&A with the performers. Now, without further ado, Tim McAllister and Liz Ames.
Thank you so much for being a part of this and for tuning in. The first work we will be performing tonight on this Night Note series is a new work, a world premiere that you're hearing, entitled Rise, by the composer Karalyn Schubring. Karalyn is a very young composer, only just now in graduate school. I first got to know her, as well as Dr. Ames, when she was a student of composition at the University of Michigan. She's also a tremendous pianist and has performed her own works, including a recent piano concerto that she got to perform with the Symphony Orchestra at the University of Michigan. And we asked Karalyn to write essentially a short work for us. This sneak peeks for you, is a little sneak preview for you of an upcoming project with me and Dr. Ames, which will include an album of short kind of encore works or concert openers. They could sort of serve either purpose. She wrote this piece for us for a New York City premiere recital that we were going to do in May of 2020. And sadly, like everything else, it was canceled. And this work will open this program, and we think it's quite evocative, and it retains and holds that spirit of her writing and just her character. She's an incredibly jubilant person, and we think this piece captures that. We hope you enjoy the world premiere of Rise by Karalyn Schubring. The next work we're performing is the Romance for Saxophone and Piano, written in 1954 by William Grant Still. William Grant Still is widely thought of as the great dean of African American composers. And we're so fortunate to see just a rebirth, a revival of interest in his music in recent years. He lived until 1978 and wrote incredible symphonies and operas and ballet. And this was his one work for saxophone. And it was later arranged, taken from this version that you'll hear for saxophone and piano, and orchestrated for an incredible, beautiful work for saxophone and orchestra. So we're delighted to share this work with you. The William Grant Still Romance for Saxophone and Piano. be performing is the Fantasie for violin and piano, originally, by the great French composer Olivier Messiaen. The work was written in 1933, and here tonight it's adapted for soprano, saxophone, and piano. Messiaen is a very important composer in the history of the 20th century and was an incredible teacher and professor at the Paris Conservatoire. He influenced so many composers that all wrote for the saxophone. And sadly, we do not have an original work by Messiaen for the saxophone. But the spirit of his music finds its way into all of our French repertoire in the later years of the 20th century. We hope you enjoy the Fantasie for violin and piano. This next work you're going to hear is another world premiere performance. This is by the Detroit native, Chad Hughes. Chad was born in 1977, attended Cass Tech High School, and attended his undergraduate at the University of Michigan, where I met him many years ago. He wrote this work that we were to premiere earlier this year as well, and we felt this was a wonderful opportunity to pair this with other compositions on this program. S.L.I.C.E is the title. It was inspired from an earlier violin and piano work, and he took it and reorchestrated it and thought of it as much more appropriate, really, for saxophone with its wildly shifting sounds and grooves throughout. You can hear Afro-Cuban, Afro-American music, but in his case, borrowing upon Cuban tradition, reggae, also even like calypso sounds in the Mediterranean. You find throughout the piece it just has this really incessant groove all the way through, almost like dance mix music. It's a high energy piece. We'll be performing it and recording it this year. We hope you enjoy S.L.I.C.E by Chad Hughes. final work on this program is by another Detroit son, the great Rudy Wiedoeft. Wiedoeft was really the godfather of modern saxophone. He was an icon on the Detroit scene, New York and Chicago circuit in the 1920s. He was single-handedly the most important figure in vaudeville music. He wrote so many works for himself to perform that became performed by saxophonists all over the world within a very short time. Some of his most famous compositions were written 100 years ago during the last pandemic. And this work, Valse, Vanite, it comes from 1921. It was published later in 23. So a 100-year-old composition that really is the spirit of that time. Maybe that transfer from this, the dark time that they encountered into the roaring 20s and the sounds of vaudeville. Rudy Wiedoeft was the first artist signed to Thomas Edison Records. And so the cylinders of his music could be heard in households all over the country and all over the radio stations. It's literally iconic music for the saxophone, maybe the true indigenous music for the saxophone. And we thought no better fitting of piece to end our program tonight. We hope you enjoy Rudy Wiedoeft's Valse Vanite.
Hold on.
Hello. Hi, Tim. Hi, Liz.
Hello.
What an amazing performance. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here with us tonight. And thank you for everyone who's watching for joining us. We are here live and we're going to do a little question and answer session. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the comments and we'll be sure to address that. So what an amazing performance, and the Wiedoeft is so much fun. What a great way to end. Why don't we start from your origin story? So Liz, can you tell us how did the McAllister Ames duo get formed? When did you two start playing together?
So I actually was doing my doctorate at Arizona State University while Tim was the saxophone professor there. And one of the reasons why I decided to go to Arizona State University is because I played for a lot of saxophones and I really loved the repertoire. And I knew he was the saxophone professor there, and they just so happened to have a collaborative piano program at ASU. So I headed out that way, kind of in a very, I guess, seemingly overconfident way, knocked on his door and said, "I'm going to play for your students," which doesn't sound like me, but that's how he tells the story. Yeah. So I kind of question that sometimes. But I ended up playing for all of his students. And then when Tim got the position at Northwestern University, it made the most sense for me to also head up to Chicago. And when he came out here to University of Michigan, it seemed like it made the most sense for me to keep on going too, especially with a young baby on the way at that time, knowing that we could grow up here and it would be pretty great. But I think it was 2012, fall 2012 was our first performance together. So that was after all of my coursework had been done. We moved to Chicago, and that's when we started working together officially.
Great. And now you have a great discography together and recordings released recently. Can you tell us about the recordings you released over the last year?
You gonna do that?
Well, I think I think really humbly, we were quite productive in this past year during this whole COVID pandemic. We were privileged and honored to release 2 albums that basically at the same time, 2 albums that came out within a few weeks of one another. The first was an album that was about 5 years in the making, entitled Notturno. And it featured a lot of composers who meant something very much to us, kind of namely some personal connections through composers like Stephen S.L.I.C.E. And of course, we felt it was necessary to put our stamp on the great sonata of William Albright. And so albums take a long time. And for us, we kind of chipped away at it over a number of years. So it's a great document for our collaboration over those years. And features some really iconic pieces. And then in March of 2018, we recorded an entire album of the British composer Andy Scott, who resides in Manchester, England. And we flew out to a beautiful coastal town east of London to record in this amazing recording studio. That where you can go out there and you can actually live in the quarters on the campus of this concert hall, basically converted barn converted into a beautiful recording space. So we went out there. I think we spent 3 days out there. Maybe, is that right, Liz? When we, with the whole team, production team, and the composer as producer, and we recorded an entire album of his music, and that's on the Naxos label. And it's great stuff. Hope you can check it out.
Wonderful. We have a question in the chat from the president of Detroit Chamberwinds, Moriokin. He said, "That was amazing, Tim. I'm wondering if you could take only one instrument to a desert island, which would it be? And how different are the saxophones from each other?"
If I could take clarification, one of the saxophones to a desert island, or any instrument?
He says instrument, so let's go with that.
Well, I think it has to be saxophone. So, but if it's a matter of which of the family, and I had to choose one of the family, I think it still has to be the bread and butter, the alto saxophone, the one we start on, the one that kind of we essentially fall in love with the saxophone through. And it's not until later that we branch out into the larger saxophones, the tenor and the baritone. And of course, the soprano saxophone really requires quite a bit of maturity as the young student ages and the embouchure gets stronger, and there's sort of a weight factor of holding it up and all of that. But yeah, I think it would still get back to my first true love, which would be the alto saxophone. When it's about the difference of all of them, I mean, the whole family goes. The primary family that we think of is the saxophone quartet, and that's the one that's most typically written for in the wind band, the concert band: soprano, alto, tenor, baritone. But there is a bass saxophone, and then there's a contrabass saxophone larger than that. Those, in some ways, are almost like novelty items. But the bass saxophone is really, in recent years, come into its own as a more of an instrument people have written for or use in productions and things. And then you have an instrument that goes smaller than the soprano, and that would be the sopranino saxophone. So Adolphe Sax envisioned 7 instruments in the family. And then he envisioned a band family of B flat and E flat instruments, and he envisioned an orchestral family that he called that would be pitched in F and C. Those instruments did exist, but they were kind of short-lived. And the E flat and B flat is what persevered to this day. And the keyboard is the same. We all read the same notes on the page. We all read in treble clef, whether it's a bass instrument or a high treble instrument. We read the same notes on the page, but it all sounds different, and it all sounds in different ranges. The reeds are all different sizes. The mouthpieces are larger and smaller, for each instrument. And so there's a bit of a physical difference between instruments, and ergonomic difference between all the instruments. And the larger instruments kind of require a lot more air and all of that. But some people just kind of gravitate to the different sizes for different reasons, different restrictions. Maybe they feel like it's just too heavy to hold a baritone all day. And some people, just prefer the ergonomics of the smaller instruments. Yeah.
Janelle Robinson says, why did you select the pieces you played, and can you tell us a little bit about the composers?
Well, so, I mean, we could maybe, but Liz can chime in a little bit on this, but partly we wanted to rekindle the plans that we had prior to the beginning of the pandemic, where we were going to do a big concert in New York City that was to happen in May of 2020, and that concert was sadly canceled. And on that concert, we were going to be premiering the first work you heard, Karalyn Schubring's Rise. That was one of the centerpieces of that program. Really, I mean, that, and Chad Hughes's piece, who you heard as well, S.L.I.C.E, that was to be part of a recording project that we are now underway doing. That piece was sort of on our docket. So then it came a matter of just filling out a program that we felt would really fit with the Nightnotes programming, and something that would be really widely accessible for a larger audience. And that's when we started to look at these other pieces. And maybe, Liz, you want to talk about the William Grant Still and why we programmed that?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest and most important topics that we're talking about, especially, is making sure that we incorporate a diverse program of repertoire in every program that we do now. Mm-hmm. And William Grant Still was a prominent African-American composer and conductor in his time, and it's a beautiful piece in our repertoire, and it's been coming even more to life as we go through time now. And I'm so glad that we've really kind of brought it into our core repertoire. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think activism is important to us, and cultural activism in which we really represent underrepresented voices in the classical music world, whether it's female composers or BIPOC figures. And here we have this amazing work written for the saxophone by William Grant Still, and it's been orchestrated with orchestra. It's amazing. And we decided to do a virtual kind of one of these virtual recording projects in the middle of the summer last year, where we were just feeling so disconnected from one another. We weren't able to play and rehearse and even be in each other's presence. We were in our own kind of mutual lockdowns. And so you can find it online as well on YouTube, our recording of the William Grant Still. And I think it was, really timely at the moment. We were going through all of this BLM movement in the middle of the summer. And we're just very fortunate to have an amazing piece like this. And our belief is it should become standard repertoire that is taught by every, saxophone teacher and student alike in the world. And then we felt it was kind of great to pair that with a living African-American composer in Chad Sir-Wick Hughes, and then the connection with Detroit. And then I wanted to go back and look at programming that drew upon music during the last big global pandemic. And that worked out perfectly, that the music of Rudy Wiedoeft intersects with not only Detroit's iconic history, but also the fact that he was writing these pieces that formed the core of vaudeville music. He was writing this music in the beginning of that pandemic in the 20s, in the early 20s, or 1918, 1920. And, so we had like this juxtaposition of one of, Detroit's oldest icons, along with a youngish composer, who came from Detroit. So it just all worked out. We felt it was really great. And we're also going to be reprising the music of Rudy Wiedoeft as part of as part of an upcoming Detroit Chamber Winds program next year that was also canceled this past year, featuring vaudeville music. So a whole vaudeville revival. So we wanted to give a little bit of a teaser for that program that Liz and I will be doing as well.
Maury had a follow-up question. He said, I was wondering if you like to play soprano so you could be the lead in the saxophone quartet, similar to why someone would want to play first violin in the string quartet. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, some people, feel that way about the soprano chair, but also there's kind of the other side of that where, something like the baritone saxophone chair in the quartet is really that engine from below, that whole harmonic foundation. I think there's a little bit of, from a historic standpoint, the lead violin of a string quartet might have that role, 100 years ago, where maybe the name of the string quartet might have been named after the principal violin or the first violin, or the compositions themselves favored featuring the first violin. In the saxophone quartet, I think we really have found that it's pretty equal. There's quite a bit of equity across the four members. So I don't think I feel like I'm the star or anything, but it's nice to have the lightest instrument and the one that fits on all the airplanes. So there.
One that fits on all the airplanes. That's certainly an issue that we have to deal with. One of the reasons I wanted to study with you, Dr. McAllister, is because I really respect your personal mission to work with composers, commissioning new music, expanding the repertoire for our instrument, and helping to establish the saxophone as a classical instrument, because a lot of people don't know that the playing that you do really even exists. So I was wondering if you could talk about why it's important to keep continuing advocating for the saxophone, and how does commissioning and contemporary music fit into that?
Well, I mean, I certainly am not, rare in that instance. I mean, I look to my amazing mentors and figures who helped pave that way for me. Someone like Donald Cinta and other figures who are still active today, like John Sampin, and there were so many figures in our history that just sort of it was their mission at a point in time where there was an incredible void of literature. And I think of them as the real pioneers, but I think we honor them by continuing that mission. And in fact, it is our duty. It is bred into us as saxophone players, as we study this instrument in a conservatory or school of music environment. It's part of our mandate, if you will. And if new music is at the core of our activities, we certainly have to make sure we're also joining that with certain missions to, as I said earlier, to elevate underrepresented voices, because the amount of creative minds in this world is limitless, really. So I think commissioning is one aspect of that. Part of it is also looking into that research, the levels of scholarship and research that start to illuminate a history there that in some ways was what was pushed down and suppressed as well. When we talk about voices that have been suppressed throughout time, there's also a history of classical saxophone that was suppressed as well. It was an instrument that was outlawed in Nazi Germany. It was an instrument that was outlawed because it was considered a degenerate instrument, and the classical music written for it wasn't considered legitimate. And the popular music of the time, and the dance music and music coming out of the Weimar Republic era and all of that was considered, inappropriate. So we have an element of activism in our instrument as well, and I think it's been something that we feel like we have a lot to prove, and it drives all of us. I talk about this a lot with Liz because she's a pianist, and she's an amazing concert pianist who's decided to devote a large portion of her life to working with saxophonists. So why do you like doing that, Liz?
Sometimes I wonder. No, no, I love the instrument, and I really love the people. I don't think I would have stayed in this particular niche had it not been for the incredible people I've worked with over the last almost 20 years. And it's always, I think a part of it is the sound itself. When working with a great saxophonist, the sound is so vocal, and there's so much versatility to the instrument. And it can be a solo instrument, but it can and really have incredible melodies. But when I listen to like a quartet piece, it's really contemporary and really driving and everything. It can be percussive and raw and not beautiful, which is something that I love about contemporary music. Life isn't always beautiful, and that's what makes it great. So I really have always enjoyed working with saxophonists, and I really enjoy working with the repertoire, and I love working with composers. And had I gone a different route and specialized in a different area, maybe strings, or maybe really working with a lot of flute repertoire or something, I might not have had as many opportunities to work with composers. Because their repertoire, especially with strings, you can really get kind of caught in the realm of Beethoven and playing Franck all the time, and Brahms. You can make an entire career out of playing those pieces of repertoire for these instruments, and not exit and meet the composers of our time. So saxophone has really been that outlet for me. But yeah, I think that's one of the best parts about playing for saxophonists, really, is truly the people. So yeah.
We have time for one more question from C. Helm in the chat. He says, as a young saxophonist, I'm curious about what you do to communicate effectively with your music through the saxophone. That's a loaded question for you, Tim.
Communicate. Well, I mean, if we're talking about communicating with an audience, or communicating with, even just through a recording where there's no kind of visual element, if we're talking about that, I mean, first and foremost, we have to have this incredible level of preparation that just allows us to be very comfortable and to feel like all of those techniques and all those difficult challenges of the instrument are fully integrated in kind of almost like a subconscious level, that you can really just play and get past those technical boundaries and get past those barriers. I think that's true for all instrumentalists and singers, and I mean all of it. So we have to get past the technical, but that requires years and years of painstaking work, and in some ways we say all of that work is never ending. We never truly arrive. So I think to get to the point where I can communicate the intent of the music and to try to channel the composer, yeah, I feel like there's all that time that comes into mastering the technical. And then I just try to do everything I can to put myself in the mindset of that composer. And especially if the context of which of the time that they wrote that music. You may have noticed in this program tonight, I tried to channel a very different sound in the Rudy Wiedoeft Valse Vanite compared to, say, the first piece, the Karalyn Schubring piece, which actually has a bit of nostalgic quality to it. There's kind of an older sound that starts that piece that kind of is reminiscent of almost like a noir era or a film cinematic waltz or something like a Shostakovich jazz waltz. Yet, but the Wiedoeft requires a certain sense of duty to that color of the vaudeville era, to really try to channel his playing. We're very fortunate that in something like Rudy Wiedoeft's music, we have recordings of the man. So we really can just sort of study it from a scholarly level. The way vibrato was approached at the time, or the flexibility of the sound at the time, and the various techniques like double tonguing or whatever. But I think I think it is a great challenge to communicate music by essentially dead composers when you're trying to really try to imagine the instrument that they heard at the time, or the players that they interacted with at the time, and then to try to take that idea and elevate it further. Like, I would love William Grant Still to have heard me today and say that, that is exactly how I imagined it. Or even better, if a composer like that was to be resurrected and say, I never imagined the saxophone could sound that good. Maybe that's what drives me whenever I play music by composers that have passed. And we often bemoan the fact that we missed out on some major figures like Johannes Brahms. Johannes Brahms intersected with the saxophone. He intersected with Adolph Sax. Did he hear the instrument? Most likely he did. What was that experience? It was the instrument in its infancy. And most likely it wasn't very good, frankly. So that's just going to be the way. That's just what we have to be honest with ourselves and realize that violin had been so established and clarinet had been so established, and every mainstream instrument had been so established by the time Brahms had even kind of heard this novelty instrument, this essentially manufactured and invented instrument out of the blue. I'm sure he scoffed at it and laughed at it. But we were lucky to get some composers like Debussy or Bizet or Ravel. We got all these figures early on that did take a chance on the instrument, and they took a chance on the instrument at a time where it was gaining this kind of popularity. And I think the history of every piece that you play is an opportunity to channel that moment in time. And that happens with the core repertoire we teach, whether it's some kind of romantic concerto by Glazunov, or if we're playing something very current, very modern, written yesterday, we have an opportunity to channel those moments in time. And that's what helps, at least if I think that way, it helps me communicate as much as I can through the music. That's a loaded answer to a loaded question, but it's I think it takes a lifetime. I think we all try to get past the instrument. We all try to get past those boundaries. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, it was a great question. Well, thank you both so much for being here with us tonight. And thank you to everyone who's listening. There's 2 events upcoming that I want to let you all know about. They're both part of our Structurally Sound series, where we pair music with interesting locations in Metro Detroit. And we're having our first virtual Structurally Sound. It's coming up on May 14th at 7 p.m. And that is going to be filmed at the Motown Mansion with bassoonist Jeff Lyman, another University of Michigan faculty member, and lots of other amazing guest musicians on that performance. And then later on this year in November, we have a live Structurally Sound with Tim McAllister and Liz Ames, our guests here today. And we'll be doing Vaudeville Revival at the Redford Theater. So stay tuned for more information on both of those concerts. Tim, Liz, thank you so much. It's great to see you again, and have a great night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.